Hello, welcome to another edition of Champions Briefs video topic analysis. I'm Daniel Shatzkin, and I'm joined with Nethmin and Liyanage, and we're going to be talking about the new topic, Resolve, the United States ought to guarantee universal childcare. This is an interesting topic because it's an incredibly broad topic with a couple of different interpretations onto what exactly qualifies. The topic also carries some unique aspects to it, such as that it doesn't specify country potentially, or really what a guarantee means, or even what childcare is. I guess to start off, there's kind of the current state of childcare, where we're at in America, how we provide it, and then moving forward, I guess just some of those interesting definitions. So topically, I viewed it as kind of the government ought to create child care centers for everyone to have access to, in a way like there's public school for people in like K through 12. There should be a public child care option for people younger than that. Like, elementary school is for, fifth graders. There is a public pre-K. That's to me what the topic is kind of asking in some sense, but I know that there are other interpretations on the topic. What's your opinion on it?
So I agree with you that intuitively the topic would seem as though it's going to be federally created public childcare centers for children who are too young to be in traditional school. However, I think that there are also a lot of other interpretations floating around. First is the idea that the federal government provides some kind of bailout or subsidy to existing childcare centers or childcare industries. I think that this is an interesting take on the topic because it's definitely a patchwork of childcare centers across the nation. There's definitely no national company. So I think that there will probably be enforcement arguments or just circumvention arguments that the negative could read against affirmatives that defend this method of creating universal childcare. I've also seen various ideas being kicked around about it being some kind of a stipend or a tax credit paid or given to parents or families based on how many children they have and what the children's ages are. This is also super interesting because I think that this is very similar to past topics we've had, like universal basic income, and I haven't seen a ton of clear delineation in the topic literature about how this would differ from just cutting checks to everyone every single year or month. I think that the last major interpretation of the topic is that universal childcare extends into grade school, high school, whatever, and that this interpretation of the topic would include giving money to the current existing publicly funded middle schools and high schools and elementary schools, and creating or naming that as a form of universal childcare in the form of investing in education. So I think those are the three main areas of the topic I've seen beyond just the intuitive knee-jerk interpretation. And within those buckets, there are definitely nuances and specific plans that can be done.
Right, so I think let's talk about those the second and third interpretations, because I think that's kind of where current U.S. policy is. The second interpretation that you gave us was bailing out child care centers, and I kind of feel like functionally that's what like Head Start programs provide and things like that. They're providing funding for these child care centers in impoverished areas. They're kind of subsidizing. They're not necessarily bailing out, but it's like a subsidy for childcare that's available for lower income individuals. So it's not the direct payment option, but it's also, I guess, not like the economic bailout. I think it's kind of like the middle way right now that we're paying for pre-K. But then the third option, I think, is also an interesting one on the topic, because right now, Elizabeth Warren and Mitt Romney have both made proposals along the lines of direct payments, kind of like the earned income tax credit. But instead of it being a tax credit, it's like, the UBI, where you said it's like cutting a check. I think it's important because those are going to be definitely debated about on this topic. And it's also going to provide an internal or a link probably to a lot of politics scenarios, the debates around those bills. I think Elizabeth Warren is like $3,000 a year per child, and Mitt Romney is $300 a month per child. So it's like there's not actually that much of a difference between the two plans. It's, I think, funding mechanisms that are different between them. There's some nuances, and obviously Romney's is like for 3,600 versus Warren's is like for 3,000 per child. But that's kind of what's currently going on. I think also it's interesting that we talk about childcare in terms of like we've talked about access for the most part, like that's that one view of the topic. I think there's also a view of the topic that's going to be one of quality, right? To guarantee universal childcare would probably also make some statement of guaranteeing a similar quality of universal childcare. And if we look at like some statistics around childcare, there are some pretty like gross inadequacies about the quality of childcare between like impoverished communities and wealthier communities, where children from lower income homes have limited access to books. There are fewer home and preschool language literacy opportunities for preschoolers. The schools themselves have less access to quality literature. This stuff is coming, by the way, from the Literacy Project, which analyzed like child literacy rates and stuff. And they found that just having like access to childcare doesn't really mean you're gaining any benefit from that childcare, at least for the child purposes. The parent is probably being able to go to work, but the child doesn't necessarily benefit from just being watched. So I think there's probably some unique debates that can be had on access versus quality, and what universal actually means and what we're trying to universalize. Are we universalizing the access alone, or the access and quality?
I agree. And I think that a lot of affirmatives need to be prepared to answer back these quality questions, because I think that's one of the first questions I would raise, especially as a negative debater in more traditional rounds, which is going to be the bulk of this topic for most teams. And I would say that for affirmative debaters, even if they aren't planning on cutting a specific plan app or reading a solvency advocate or a plan text, I think that affirmative debaters should still cut evidence about how they envision their affirmative looking, and specifically how their affirmative is going to cater to issues of inequality. I think that as I was reading the topic literature, one of the big issues I found was that a lot of childcare programs that are more financially accessible, which is presumably what would also be provided by the federal government or a stipend that parents could use for that purpose. I think that one of the biggest issues was the pay of the teachers or the caregivers. And I think that teacher pay and work environments are things that the affirmative plan needs to account for, because if not, I agree that I think wealthy families will still end up better off, even in a post-affirmative world.
Especially if we're talking about extending it beyond preschools to like elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. Then you're starting to really get into like an achievement gap and a funding gap, and stuff like that can exist there. So I just want to note on the topic itself, on some definitions, is that the United States is not a defined entity, right? We all have a gut check instinct of United States meaning United States of America. But there are some other like countries that have historically called themselves the United States, or via translation into English roughly translate into the United States. For example, historically, there's the United States of Brazil, which is what the Second Republic of Brazil was called, which existed in like the 1800s, and is no longer a actual governing body. Some tricky truth testing, a priori-esque debater may try and utilize these types of arguments to say like the Second Republic of Brazil no longer is a government with any like governing power, therefore they can't provide universal child care, and you negate. Or they can do things like shift the debate to the United States of Mexico, because technically Mexico is the Federal Republic States of Mexico in translated out into from Spanish to English. And if you were to define United States as a federation of states, which is a actual definition of United States, is a federation of states connected like regionally, technically Mexico meets that definition. Lots of different federated republics meet that kind of loose definition from, I think Australia is technically a federated republic. Canada is a federated republic. They're all federal systems with states that are unified under some form of government. So there are a lot of ways that negatives and tricky affirmatives, for that matter, can try and expand the topic and talk about things that debaters may not be prepped for. So I think there's going to be some key arguments that need to be prepped for, like, United States means America, and just some theory arguments on that too. Thoughts?
Yeah, I agree that the United States of Mexico AF is always a risk we run whenever we have a topic that says the United States. But I think on this particular topic, there are also questions of genuine jurisdiction and topicality, even if you do buy the standard as written definition of the United States, which is 50 states plus DC. The first question that came to mind for me was U.S. territories or special administrative regions, American Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and one more, Northern Mariana Islands. All of those are U.S. territories and have varying degrees of involvement with the U.S. government. And obviously things like statehood for Puerto Rico are also political questions right now. So I think that the affirmative should be prepared to answer questions about what their affirmative looks like in those territories, because those are genuine questions of what the U.S. government does. And then the other question that came to mind for me was indigenous tribes, because obviously indigenous tribes have some small level of sovereignty. And so how the United States federal policies would impact indigenous tribes. And additionally, even if the affirmative says, yes, indigenous people are included in our creation of universal childcare, how does that play out in terms of resourcing and employment and hiring and things like that? So I think that those are questions.
I want to just highlight Native American groups really quickly. I want to talk about issues kind of related to Native American groups in a moment. But like, really good point, and like, debaters should definitely be trying to think outside of the box a little bit with just general populations. But yeah, continue on. I just want to note we'll go back to Native American groups in a little bit.
Those were my major notes regarding even if you buy into topical definitions of the US, here are some questions that you will need to answer. In terms of more tricky definitions or negatives trying to link offense into something that the affirmative doesn't defend, I think that affirmatives can protect themselves from this by reading a definition of United States in the 1AC if you think that your opponent is going to try to make those arguments, because as soon as you read a definition of United States being 50 states plus DC, you are just ahead on the T debate in terms of evidence quality and in terms of authorship. Similarly, I think that when your opponents are trying to make these arguments regarding, for example, the United States of Mexico and how the affirmative would impact that, I think that you should very much be asking to see their evidence, because a lot of their evidence is not going to link to the evidence in your affirmative. So I think a good portion of the 1AR can just be spent pointing out how that evidence does not answer the 1AC. And then if you are on the negative side of this debate, i.e. they try to define United States as Australia or a former version of Brazil, I think that preparing T and theory arguments are both good ideas, and specifically preparing T and theory arguments for more than one definition of United States, because I think a lot of debaters are prepared to stand up and read one version of topicality or defend one definition of the topic. But I think that having multiple T definitions, and in this case, T definitions that answer back all of the major potential definitions of United States, are going to be things that are really helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that extends out to other words in the topic, like guarantee. Does that mean that, is a guarantee, like we talked about before, is that just providing the economic, money for it? Or is that actually creating the institutions? When we talk about universal, is that allowing access, or is that allowing, a same kind across the entire, quality, same kind of quality across the entire populace. So I think having multiple definitions for each of these words on this topic is definitely important. And then also childcare, being able to defend a limited definition of childcare or a more expansive one that involves schools will definitely be an important issue here. I guess going from definitions, let's talk about some affirmative cases. My instant reaction is usually to look for utilitarian benefits to a topic. And so off the bat, my first two like gut instincts were food security and kind of long-term economic growth, economic security. Um, Food security in that, you know, schools provide generally meals for a large segment of the population. There's a large population of food insecure children. It functions as both like a utilitarian impact and also a form of structural violence. Like it just seemed like a pretty good impact on the topic to me. And then on the economic side, there's all sorts of evidence about, you know, education and growth. The fact that childcare is needed for recovery from COVID that we're in right now so that parents can get back to work, just parents being able to work. So on face, those were kind of what I kind of thought of first. What about you?
I definitely agree that those were some of my first thoughts, especially the coronavirus related arguments, because I think that there are a lot of statistics about how coronavirus has disproportionately impacted women and gender minorities in the context of the workforce and how they are specifically being given a lot more of the burden of childcare. So I think that this can be taken in two directions. First is kind of the economic benefits that you talked about and making the argument that women and gender minorities are an essential component of the US labor force, and getting women and gender minorities back into work is necessary for increasing US GDP, economic growth, all that stuff. But I think that the other way that debaters can take it, and I think the way a lot of debaters will take it, is reading a more structural violence oriented affirmative. I think that there is a lot of good literature out there about how families of color, or families who are led by a gender minority, or families who are low income, are all struggling right now to find childcare, and specifically to find quality childcare. There's a debate being had about parents having to trade off between having childcare that they're comfortable with, or having to hand their children off to another relative who then won't be able to work, or they themselves having to take time off of work. So I think that structural violence-oriented affirmatives are going to be pretty good on this topic, and I think that that's a direction that a lot of debaters will go, especially with more traditional judges and not being able to have as extensive of a link chain to nuclear war like we always try to have. I think that a lot of debaters are just going to go for intuitive, feel-good arguments. So I'd advise negative debaters to prep against those types of affirmatives, even if they don't intend to read one. And then within the subset of structural violence type affirmatives, I think that there is also a really good just whole res feminism AC. This I'm not sure how popular it will be, just because a lot of traditional districts are not as oriented towards just hearing about 6 minutes of fem. But I think that at the few progressive or semi-progressive tournaments that there are on this topic, like for example, I know the Texas state tournament has a pretty deep progressive judging pool. I think at those tournaments, there will definitely be room for whole res feminism affirmative, as well as for more explicit plan affirmatives that defend a specific implementation of the topic with a specific definition for universal childcare.
Yeah, I think a lot of how you go on the app is going to depend on kind of the circuits that you're debating on. Definitely the case with some of the more progressive arguments. Speaking of some progressive app arguments, on the critical side, I kind of see that like capitalism, neoliberalism being kind of bidirectional in some senses. In many ways, like the app kind of allows more people to engage in the capitalist system because like childcare and justifications for universal childcare are usually centered around like returning people to the workforce and needing universal childcare to have like universal employment and those types of quotes. But I also can see it going the other way in that it's like a collectivization of childcare, and it's a socialization of childcare, and so it's a move away from capitalist states. Beyond capitalism, what are some of the more critical arguments that you think might appear on affirmatives on some more progressive circuits?
Yeah, for sure. So we already talked a bit about fem affirmatives, and you just talked about cap. I think that those will probably be the largest critical affirmatives on the topic, but I think that there is also room for more structural violency, soft left inclusion good type arguments, i.e. race-based arguments or economic status-based arguments. But I think that in terms of topical critical affirmatives, the topic is already pretty critical and pretty identity oriented. So I think that a lot of the affirmatives that we would that have topic areas that we might sometimes label as critical, like fem or capitalism, for example, will just be pretty standard whole res affs on this topic just by function of the way the topic goes. So I think that any of the true KAFs on this topic would probably be some kind of rejection or redefinition of the resolution. And there is definitely a lot of literature about why we should reject, for example, discourse on regarding the future or discourse regarding the state or specific focus on children. So I think that those critical arguments are all able to be made, but they would be made as a rejection of the resolution, and other arguments would just become whole res soft left Fs.
Agreed. On the more traditional side, my first instinct was like a communitarianism F. If I were to be cutting like a traditional ethics-based affirmative, just because it seems in line with a communitarian ethic of like helping everybody out and making sure each person can kind of fulfill their community needs and community obligations. But I know there are probably some other takes on the topic that we can probably look at, Rawlsian, potentially a Kantian take on the topic. What are your opinions on some of those more traditional takes?
I think that when debating traditionally, Rawls is always a really good option for topics like this. And I think that Rawls has specific literature about how the ideas, how ideas of equality and the way the state engages with them should be applied to children or dependents or minors. So I think that Rawls is a really good affirmative to read on this topic, and one that we included a bunch of cards for in our brief. Similarly, I think that there are some more social contract oriented approaches. So this topic is pretty centered around equality. So I think that any claim the affirmative wants to make is going to be somewhat related to equality in some way. I don't think that there's a way you can affirm this topic and avoid discussions of equality and inequality. And so as such, I think that a social contract based approach that talks specifically about how part of the social contract and why people give up their rights to the sovereign is in exchange for some level of equality or some guarantee that they will have somewhat equal opportunities. So I think that there's also a social contract act that could be pretty good for debating traditionally that is centered around equality. I also think that traditional debaters can get away with reading more utilitarian arguments, not in the sense of nuclear war, but more so in the sense of economic benefits and benefits to the general populace. So I think that if your district is less open to inequality or structural violence-based arguments, you can definitely go that route, especially in light of things like COVID vaccines rolling out and economic recovery. So I think that's also a good approach for traditional debating. I think that the arguments on this topic are going to be very similar across the traditional and national circuits, and it's just going to be a question of presentation and implementation. So I would say this feels a bit similar to the standardized testing topic to me in terms of arguments about inequality being the center of the topic and them just being presented differently for traditional and progressive judges.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that take. I guess let's move on to the negative. When working on my topic analysis, it was admittedly a little hard for me to kind of come up with some negative positions because a lot of them feel kind of heartless when you get into the literature. It just, I think, is the nature of some of the affirmatives when it's, about public assistance. If the app is about public assistance, it's hard to maybe make negative claims without seeming a little bit uncaring towards the problems of others. So I just think that that's going to be an issue on this topic inherently if you're going to be arguing under like a traditional AF means to affirm the resolution, neg means to say it's not true. Like, it's hard to say people don't need aid without sounding uncaring towards some of their claims. So it's just going to be some kind of line that I think negative debaters have to walk kind of on. It's not to say that there aren't traditional arguments to justify the negative under this topic. I think there are definitely libertarian arguments that exist. I think there are some federal arguments, federalism-based arguments that function under traditional obligations like constitutionality claims and things like that aren't necessarily uncaring claims, but are just like the federal government cannot obligate, states to provide this. It's up to the states to do it. Claims like that. What are your thoughts on traditional negatives?
So my first thought when I looked at this resolution when it was first released was I thought that the spending disad was going to be the big traditional negative argument of the topic. But the more I read into it, the more I realized that even the most Republican think tanks just are not producing spending disad evidence on this topic. So I think that the spending disad is I would just advise debaters to steer away from it because the evidence quality on there is not great, nor is the believability. In addition, even like the Trump White House had promised some kind of childcare package. So I just don't think the spending decid's the way to go. So I know that a lot of traditional negative debaters, that's their first approach. So if you're cutting cards the night before your national qualifier, just keep going, move on from that one. But beyond the spending disad, I think that the negative arguments that you mentioned are going to be the best ways to negate the topic without sounding totally awful. I think that the negative can make claims about the ways in which, even if equality is good and even if they agree with the thesis principles of the affirmative, that doesn't mean that the federal government has an obligation to provide childcare, or specifically that the federal government does not have an obligation to provide universal childcare. So even if some level of childcare help is good, it should look different than a federal childcare guarantee. And I think that negatives will need to be careful when making these arguments in traditional circuits because obviously some circuits have legislated counterplans out of debate. So I think that traditional debaters shouldn't stand up and read a counterplan or three. But I think that traditional debaters can present alternatives to federally guaranteed childcare and or present other things that are working better that just need to be expanded upon. So I think that the negative can also point out that there are alternative methods of solving for the affirmative's impacts. And I think that the negative can also read a lot of good solvency deficits because I think that the quality of evidence that debaters cut for traditional rounds is generally abysmal. So I think that the negative can make a lot of arguments about the implementation of the affirmative and the methods in which the affirmative debater intends for the affirmative to be done or how the app should look. And I think the negatives can make arguments about how that's going to be done badly, i.e. the argument we touched on earlier about inequality of implementation. Because I think that a lot of affirmatives will not go with build new childcare centers from the ground up. I think a lot of affirmatives will go with just help out existing childcare centers in some form. And I think especially if we're just doing a more funded version of the status quo in the world of the affirmative, the negative has lots of ground against just traditional versions of childcare being terrible. So I think that the negative has a fair amount of traditional ground. I think that they just need to make sure that they're being both tactful and strategic when they're finding it.
I agree. Moving on from the traditional ground, I just want to talk. We briefly touched that spending doesn't have kind of a good story on this topic. And also kind of I feel like on the politics scenario, for the first time in a couple of years, I think there's a legitimate return to agenda politics being a part of it. We've seen kind of the back and forth going on with the coronavirus aid that's occurred over the last couple of weeks. That seems to be passing through the House at the moment. There's immigration reform that's on the table. There's infrastructure reform that's on the table. And there is good evidence that talks about the bipartisanship of childcare. There's good evidence that talks about Congress not wanting to work together at the moment. So I think politics is also a good strategy that might work under the more util-based frameworks that are out there. Obviously, it's not going to fit under necessarily a deontological or intent-based framework, but under a consequentialist framework of some sort, the politics scenario definitely, I think, has a return under this topic.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that politics is a good option.
Mm-hmm. It's going to require debaters to stay on top of current events and what's going on in Congress right now, and that's always the case with politics. So I guess let's look towards a more critical lens of the topic. Before I said we would get back to Native American issues, when I first saw this topic, outside of the kind of traditional arguments that were on my mind. One of the first things that came to my mind was settler colonialism, in the way that the United States has historically treated Native American groups. It fits right in line with this topic. Native American boarding schools that we, as like the U.S. government, forced Native American children to go to from their reservations that we forced Native American people onto, kind of seems like a very strong link argument under this topic, in the way that childcare has been traditionally carried out by the United States government among Native American peoples in its erasure of Native American culture. It just seems to go right along with the settler colonialist literature. I think that there's a very good link story there. What are some other potential critical avenues that you've seen under the topic for the negative?
Yeah, when I first saw this topic and started looking into negative arguments, one of my first thoughts was that at progressive tournaments, queer pessimism is going to be super commodified. Lee Edelman, one of the most popular authors to read for queer pessimism, talks about representations of the child and children and the methods in which focusing on futurity and preserving futures for children is a method of anti-queer violence, and how government attempts to legislate the future always result in anti-queer violence. So obviously that's a huge oversimplification of everything Edelman has ever said. But I think that the child is one of the thesis points that a lot of queer pessimism debaters start from. And I think that obviously, given that it's a topic specifically about childcare, the queer pessimism link into the topic is going to be super strong. And I also think that we're going to see debaters who don't identify with the literature just picking it up and reading it, especially since there are a lot of already cut cards, and most teams will have one progressive tournament on the topic. So not a ton of incentive to cut, good topic prep. So I think that queer pessimism is a critical avenue that negative debaters can take but shouldn't take if they don't identify with the literature. Beyond that, I think that, like you said, CapK is always bidirectional. So I think that, but my keynote on
Always.
this, yes, I think that my note on this topic for cap critiques is that you're going to need to outleft the affirmative, because most affirmatives are always going or are already going to be some version of like socialism good or socialized programs good. So I think that the CapK probably needs to go further left and just go for the AF isn't doing enough, AF still capitalist, still bad. And I think that's definitely.
I think if they run an econ advantage, it gives you a really hard link for capitalism. Like, it's key to growth. Yeah, cool. You collectivize so that there's economic growth. Like, that's where the link is. I feel like really solidly on the topic.
Yeah, I agree. I think against econ apps, CapK is a great option. I also agree with what you said about set call. I think that set call can always just function as an impact turn to state action. So in that regard, there's always a set call link as long as you're debating an affirmative that does something. But I agree that the set call link on this topic is definitely better than it has been on some topics. Beyond that, I think that there is also gender or representation-based gender critique to be read on this topic. Obviously, fem is another of those critiques that you can use as an impact turn to state action, and you can just go for the state is sexist and just go for femk that way. But I think that a lot of the representations of these affirmatives are going to be are going to have pretty antiquated gender roles, even if the conclusion of the affirmative is progressive, i.e., a lot of the topic literature makes arguments about how women are primary caregivers, or makes distinctions between male and female and just forgets every other gender, or topic literature that talks about workforce participation in the sense of like women just naturally go into lower paying jobs instead of there are systematic barriers to gender minorities having higher paying jobs, that kind of thing. So I think that a fem or gender-based critique on the negative is really good because you will have a lot of representations links, i.e. almost all of the topic lit on this topic makes arguments or makes claims or has rhetoric that isn't necessarily as woke as most gender debaters would like for it to be. So I think that there is a good femk. Beyond that, I also think
Just
that there
to
is
piggyback on femk, traditional families. Also, like the literature is centered around traditional family or heteronormative family types, where it's father mother taking care of the child, or like father mother taking care of child, leaving it with grandparents. So non-traditional family structures are left out a lot of times of the literature, and there's a lot of harming effects of that that I feel like can be criticized within the topic as well. Kind of piggybacks off the feminist topic criticism, because the feminist criticism would also probably include some of the family structure arguments and stuff there. Yeah. But yeah.
No, yeah, that's a really great point, and I think that there can definitely be some good criticisms that stem off of criticisms of the nuclear family. The other critique I was going to shout out was biopower. I know that biopower hasn't really been a super popular topic critique for 2 or 3 years now, but I think that biopower is always just like a solid option. Biopower is obviously another impact turn to state action, but I think that in this on this topic there are better links to biopower in that you are literally giving the state control of how children are raised, or giving the state control in a huge part of how children are raised, especially for affirmatives that defend like increased state funding for K through 12 education and stuff like that. I think that there are pretty good biopower links about just overstepping of states' boundaries, and specifically um, states using education or schools as sites for continued state propaganda or state control. So I think that biopower is also a decent critique to read on this topic. And I think that there are probably also some intersections between the biopower literature and the CAP literature that debaters could have a good time looking at.
Yeah, I think any critique on this topic that deals with like in groups and out groups and the way that the state creates it, so like Levinas critiques with like homogenization of groups and things like that, probably have some good negative argumentation on it, because it's, state action, state education, those types of arguments. So with that, Nethmin, do you have any closing thoughts on this topic?
The same thoughts I always have in my topic analyses, which are cut good topicality cards, please. Everyone should cut good T cards. Everyone should be cutting cards that are terms of art. Nuclear arsenals are not defined as collections of cells. There's a reason for that. Please use quotation marks in your Google searches so that you're getting terms of art cards, not instance definitions of each word of the topic. So please cut good T cards, and please read good T shells. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off that, I would also say read good impacts on this topic. For structural violence impacts, you don't have to get to like a terminal effect outside of increasing poverty, but explain to me what poverty does to the human condition, why I as a judge should necessarily care about poverty versus like an extinction claim or an inequality claim. I think debaters in general have lost some of the value to life claims and the importance of those value to life claims in recent years, and have just taken them for granted. And I think on a topic like this, it's very important to center the debate back to some of those value to life claims and why promoting value to life and promoting human dignity and those types of concepts are important, and what the impact of the loss of those are onto a person. Don't just take it for granted that your judge will care about those concepts. Connect with them, show the pathos a little bit of those concepts, and get that emotional connection with your judge. So with that, I will wish you all good luck in your preparation for the March-April topic. And we here at Champions Briefs, thank you for joining us. And we hope you have the best time debating on this topic.